In the American colonies during the 1700s, marriage wasn't just about two people promising to love one another. It was a serious social contract with real consequences, especially for wealthy families and prominent figures. And while America wasn't a monarchy like England or France, many customs crossed the Atlantic, shaping how colonists viewed and celebrated marriage. Among the most unusual customs carried into colonial America was the tradition of public wedding bed ceremonies, where the bride and groom's first night together wasn't private, but instead a highly visible event, witnessed by friends, family, and community leaders. To modern ears, this sounds bizarre. We think of weddings as grand ceremonies followed by private honeymoon nights. But in the 18th century, especially among the colonial elite, marriage was deeply entwined with social standing, inheritance, and public trust. A couple's union had to be beyond doubt, especially when land, money, and power were on the line. And proving that the marriage was consummated, that the bride was virtuous, and that the groom was capable, wasn't just a private matter, it was a public one. This was especially true in wealthy colonial families, like those of Virginia planters or New England merchants, who carefully guarded their estates and reputations. The wedding bed ritual served as a social guarantee, a way to prove the legitimacy of a marriage and protect the inheritance rights of future children. In a world without birth certificates or DNA tests, witnesses at the wedding bed became living proof that the marriage was real and complete. The tradition likely evolved from English customs, where royal and noble weddings sometimes included public bed ceremonies to confirm consummation. In America, it wasn't the crown overseeing these unions, but rather local churches, courts, and communities enforcing social norms. Many colonial marriages were recorded in church books, but personal honor and public acceptance mattered just as much as legal paperwork. Imagine a wealthy Virginia planter's wedding in 1740. After the church ceremony, the bride and groom didn't retreat immediately to a private chamber. Instead, a handful of trusted witnesses, family elders, prominent neighbors, and the local minister, were invited into the bridal chamber. The room would be carefully prepared, heavy drapes, fine linens, and perhaps a small fire to warm the chilly night. The witness's role was to see that the couple shared their wedding night together properly, confirming the bride's virginity and the groom's role as husband. This might include watching the couple undress, or at least seeing them together in bed before the room was darkened. While this sounds intrusive or shocking now, at the time it was seen as necessary. Questions about a woman's chastity or a man's ability to fulfill marital duties could lead to scandal, legal battles, or even annulments. The wedding bed witnesses were a safeguard to prevent such disputes. This public element of the wedding night also reinforced the idea that marriage was a contract with social and legal weight. It wasn't just a private romantic moment, it was a community event. People needed to trust that the couple's vows meant something concrete, that property would pass correctly, and that children born were truly legitimate heirs. Not all families followed this ritual strictly, and many couples sought privacy whenever possible. But colonial diaries and court records show that wedding bed ceremonies were not uncommon, especially in more traditional or socially strict communities. Some ministers even recorded attending these post-wedding room gatherings, emphasizing their importance in cementing the marriage. The consequences of ignoring or avoiding the tradition could be severe. If a marriage was called into question, due to claims the couple never consummated their union, or that the bride was not a virgin, it could spark lawsuits, family feuds, and loss of inheritance. In tight-knit colonial towns, reputation was everything, and a tarnished marriage could ruin entire families. The practice also sheds light on the gender and social dynamics of the time. Women were often seen as guardians of family honor through their purity, while men's virility proved their fitness as husbands and heads of households. The wedding bed ceremony was a rare moment where public scrutiny penetrated the most intimate part of a couple's relationship, reflecting how deeply social control reached private lives. Interestingly, some records reveal that the witness's role wasn't always straightforward. There were cases where couples staged the ritual to satisfy community expectations while maintaining some privacy. Curtains might be drawn, or witnesses asked to leave shortly after the ceremony started. In some families, older relatives might take part discreetly, while younger ones waited outside. Despite this, the mere presence of witnesses served as a powerful symbol. It told the community that the marriage was beyond reproach, that the couple was bound by law, faith, and social honor. In a world without modern verification, the wedding bed ritual was a critical piece of social glue. As America moved toward the Revolutionary era, some of these traditions began to fade or change. Ideas about privacy, individual rights, and romantic love grew stronger, especially among urban populations and younger generations. But for much of the 18th century, especially in rural or traditional colonial settings, public wedding beds were a reality, an intimate moment made visible for all to witness. This strange custom reveals how marriage in early America was less about private passion and more about public trust and legal security. It shows us a world where even the most personal acts were wrapped in ceremony, obligation, and social expectation. So next time you hear about wedding traditions, remember this peculiar 18th century practice in colonial America, where the bride and groom's first night wasn't just theirs. It belonged to the community, the church, and the law. In colonial America, the wedding bed ceremony wasn't just a ritual. It was a safeguard against one of the most feared scandals of the time, a contested or invalid marriage. The stakes were high. Marriage wasn't simply about love or companionship. It was about property, inheritance, and family honor. A single question about whether a union was consummated could tear apart families, ignite lawsuits, and ruin reputations for generations. In towns from Boston to Williamsburg, whispers often followed couples who tried to avoid or delay the wedding bed ritual. Why was this ceremony so crucial? Because, in a society governed by strict inheritance laws and rigid social codes, proving the legitimacy of a marriage meant protecting future heirs and securing the orderly transfer of wealth. Imagine a wealthy landowner in Virginia whose only daughter married a promising young man. They held a lavish ceremony, celebrated with neighbors and friends. But rumors soon circulated that the couple had not yet consummated the marriage. In a time when no medical tests or legal birth certificates existed, the community relied on witness testimony, and the wedding bed ritual was a primary source of that proof. Without witnesses to confirm the union, the groom's family might challenge the marriage, claiming their son had been deceived. Or the bride's relatives could argue that the marriage was incomplete, making her property vulnerable to confiscation or reassignment. Such disputes often escalated to local courts, dragging families into bitter battles over land and titles. Court records from the period show that contested marriages were not rare. One notorious case involved a merchant's son in Boston who married a woman from a rival family. The bride's virtue was questioned after the wedding, leading to accusations that she had concealed a previous relationship. Without clear evidence of consummation, the groom's family sought annulment to break the marriage contract and reclaim dowries. These legal battles could destroy reputations, livelihoods, and social standing. For women, accusations of impurity were especially damaging, limiting prospects for future marriages and casting long shadows over entire families. Men faced similar pressures. If unable to prove their ability to fulfill marital duties, their honor and social roles as providers and heads of households were questioned. This social pressure is why the wedding bed ritual endured despite its deeply personal nature. It was not merely about tradition, it was about protection, a community guarantee that the marriage was real and binding. However, the wedding bed ceremony also exposed the fragile balance between public scrutiny and private life. Many couples found the ritual invasive and humiliating, especially women, who bore the brunt of expectations around virginity and modesty. Some colonial diaries hint at discomfort and even fear surrounding the ceremony. One Massachusetts woman wrote in her journal about the anxiety of having family members watch the wedding night, describing the event as both a blessing and a curse, underscoring the tension between societal demands and personal privacy. In response to such discomfort, some couples sought ways to navigate the ceremony with dignity. Curtains might be drawn, or witnesses invited only briefly. In wealthier households, elaborate bedding and clothing masked intimate details, providing a layer of modesty. Yet the community still required enough transparency to accept the marriage as valid. In certain cases, this led to deception or outright fakery. Some couples arranged for actors or servants to simulate consummation or confirmation of the bride's virginity. Others staged the ritual quickly or under dim candlelight to avoid full exposure. While these tactics might satisfy social expectations, they sometimes backfired when doubts arose later. One famous scandal involved a colonial couple in Pennsylvania whose wedding bed ritual was allegedly faked. When the groom's legitimacy was challenged years later, It was revealed that witnesses had been bribed and the consummation staged. The case reached the courts and caused a major social uproar, highlighting how seriously communities took the ceremony and how much was at stake. The fallout from such scandals was more than personal embarrassment. Inheritance laws of the time heavily favored legitimate heirs, children born after a publicly recognized and consummated marriage. An annulled or disputed marriage could disinherit children, reassign land, and topple carefully planned family alliances. This made the wedding bed ceremony a legal cornerstone for colonial elites. It guaranteed that property passed according to custom and law, avoiding costly and destructive disputes. In a world where land meant power and security, the ceremony's importance cannot be overstated. Yet, the tradition also reflected the deeply patriarchal nature of colonial society. Women's bodies were surveilled as proof of family honor, while men's roles as husbands and providers were publicly affirmed. The ceremony was a reminder that marriage was not just about love, but about social order. Interestingly, as colonial America moved closer to revolution and independence, attitudes toward privacy and individual rights began to shift. The rise of Enlightenment ideas brought new perspectives on personal freedom and romantic love. Over time, the strict wedding bed rituals faded from common practice, replaced by more private celebrations. But during much of the 18th century, the wedding bed ceremony remained a crucial social institution. It bridged personal intimacy and public trust, enforcing a system where family, community, and law intersected in the most private of moments. In the tightly knit communities of colonial America, family reputation was everything, and a contested marriage could be catastrophic. The tradition of the public wedding bed was designed to prevent such disputes. But despite the ritual, disagreements over the validity of marriages and the legitimacy of heirs were not uncommon. When doubts arose, the courts became battlegrounds where families fought over property, honor, and social standing, often airing the most intimate details in public. One of the most infamous cases took place in Massachusetts in the mid-1700s and involved the wealthy Winthrop family, known for their large estates and political influence. John Winthrop Jr., a rising merchant, married Elizabeth Haverhill, a woman from a respected but less wealthy family. Their wedding was lavish, attended by the colony's elite. However, rumors soon spread that the couple's marriage had not been consummated, or at least, not publicly witnessed. After several years without children, John's family began to question the marriage's validity, worried about the lack of an heir. They petitioned the local court to investigate, arguing that without proof of consummation, the marriage could be annulled, allowing John to remarry and produce an heir. This plunged the couple into a scandal that rocked their social circle. During the court proceedings, intimate details of the couple's wedding night were debated publicly. Witnesses were called to testify about the wedding bed ceremony, the presence, or absence, of witnesses, and even Elizabeth's behavior in the days following the wedding. Some described her as modest and reserved. Others claimed she avoided the usual rituals. The public airing of these private matters shocked many but underscored how central the wedding bed tradition was to colonial society. In the end, the court ruled in favor of the marriage's legitimacy, but the social damage was done. Elizabeth was viewed with suspicion for years afterward, and the family's reputation suffered. The case demonstrated the precarious position women held, where their virtue and conduct could be scrutinized under a harsh social microscope, with very real legal consequences. Another notable case occurred in Pennsylvania, involving the prominent Quaker family of Thomas and Mary Biddle. The Biddles were known for their progressive beliefs, including more private and modest weddings, which sometimes clashed with traditional customs. When Thomas and Mary married in 1765, they opted for a simple church ceremony and declined the wedding bed ritual, believing it too invasive and inconsistent with their faith. However, their refusal to follow the tradition sparked rumors and challenges from rival families. When Thomas died unexpectedly a decade later, questions arose about Mary's status as his lawful widow and the legitimacy of their children. Competing relatives sought to invalidate the marriage to claim the Biddle estate. Once again, the courts were called upon to settle the dispute. Witnesses testified about the marriage ceremony and the absence of a wedding bed ritual, which some judges viewed as problematic. Although the Biddles' Quaker faith and marriage vows were acknowledged, the lack of public consummation testimony made the legal situation murky. The court's final decision was a compromise. Mary was recognized as the widow, but the inheritance was divided more conservatively, reflecting the doubts raised by the missing wedding bed proof. This case illustrates how religious beliefs and personal privacy sometimes clashed with legal expectations, placing women like Mary in difficult positions. The Winthrop and Biddle cases are just two examples among many where the wedding bed tradition, or lack thereof, influenced legal outcomes and social perceptions. These disputes reveal how deeply marriage was tied to property, power, and community acceptance in colonial America. Importantly, these trials also exposed the gender imbalance of the time. Women were expected to prove their chastity and compliance, while men's roles as heads of households and providers were less scrutinized. A woman accused of evading the wedding bed ceremony risked social exile and economic hardship, while men rarely faced such consequences. The public nature of these disputes meant that private marital troubles became community scandals, with neighbors and friends often choosing sides. Letters and diaries from the period show how gossip about marriages and wedding nights fueled social tensions and rivalries, shaping personal and political alliances. One poignant diary entry from a colonial woman in New York City describes her shock upon hearing of a neighbor's marriage being annulled because the wedding bed ritual was allegedly faked. She wrote about the pain and humiliation the couple endured, highlighting how the community's need for social order sometimes trampled on individual dignity. Despite these scandals, the wedding bed tradition endured for much of the 18th century because it served a critical function, maintaining clarity and trust around family lineage and property rights. Without modern institutions like birth certificates or paternity tests, the testimonies of witnesses served as the closest thing to proof the courts could accept. As the century drew to a close, changing social attitudes, the rise of romanticism, and increasing emphasis on personal privacy gradually diminished the wedding bed's role. Couples sought more private celebrations, and legal standards adapted to new ideas about love and marriage. Yet, the echoes of these public rituals and their associated scandals remind us of a time when even the most intimate moments were intertwined with law, social order, and power. In colonial America, marriage was far more than a personal union. It was a pivotal event that shaped family fortunes, social status, and community order. At the heart of this complex system was the wedding bed tradition, a practice deeply connected to inheritance laws and property rights. Yet, how this tradition played out varied greatly depending on a family's social class, wealth, and standing within their community. For wealthy colonial elites, such as Virginia planters, New England merchants, or Southern gentry, the wedding bed ceremony was a critical safeguard. These families owned vast estates, plantations, or valuable businesses, and marriage was the legal and social mechanism through which property passed from one generation to the next. Ensuring that a marriage was consummated and witnessed was essential to avoid challenges that could unravel decades of careful planning and investment. Inheritance laws of the 18th century, rooted in English common law but adapted to colonial contexts, generally favored legitimate heirs, children born within a recognized and consummated marriage. This meant that the wedding bed ritual was not just symbolic but legally significant. Without witnesses to the couple's first night, claims of illegitimacy could arise, threatening to disinherit children and redirect property to distant relatives or the crown. Records from colonial probate courts are filled with disputes where the legitimacy of children, and by extension, the validity of a marriage, was hotly contested. These conflicts often hinged on whether the couple had properly fulfilled social and legal expectations, including the wedding bed ceremony. But how did this tradition affect ordinary colonists? The answer is more complicated. Among the lower and middle classes, farmers, artisans, laborers, and small merchants, wedding customs were often simpler and less rigidly enforced. Many couples married quietly in their local churches without elaborate public rituals. Privacy and modesty were prized, and the intrusive wedding bed ceremony was often impractical or ignored altogether. However, even among common folk, proving the legitimacy of a marriage was important, especially in tight-knit rural communities where land and livestock were vital assets. While the full wedding bed ritual might have been reserved for elites, local courts and church officials still expected some form of testimony or community recognition to affirm marriages. Interestingly, many common people relied on informal witness networks. Neighbors, friends, or clergy who attended the wedding or knew the couple personally could vouch for the union's validity if disputes arose. In some cases, couples might live openly as husband and wife for years, their community acceptance serving as a form of social proof. This difference between classes highlights the role of social capital in marriage legitimacy. Wealthy families had the resources to stage public ceremonies and hire trusted witnesses, while commoners depended more on community relationships and less formal customs. Despite these variations, the core concern remained the same across classes. Marriage was a contract with tangible consequences. For both elites and commoners, legitimacy meant security, for children, property, and social standing. The wedding bed tradition also reveals much about gender roles in colonial America. Women's bodies became the focal point of legal and social control. A bride's virginity and compliance were crucial to upholding family honor and inheritance claims. Men's responsibilities as husbands, providers, and patriarchs were publicly affirmed through these ceremonies and subsequent social roles. This dynamic is evident in court cases where women's virtue was questioned, sometimes resulting in annulments or disinheritance. Conversely, men's ability to fulfill marital duties was linked to their status and authority within the household and community. The stark reality was that marriage was a public institution, not a private affair. The wedding bed ceremony embodied this reality, a ritual where personal intimacy was sacrificed for social order. For example, a wealthy Boston merchant might host an elaborate wedding followed by a witnessed wedding night, while a rural Pennsylvania farmer's family might simply gather neighbors to witness the couple's union in church and their living openly as husband and wife. In both cases, the community's recognition was key. Without it, the consequences could be dire. Legal documents from the period show how courts balanced these realities. They often weighed testimony from witnesses alongside written contracts, church records, and local customs to determine the validity of marriages and heirs. These complex intersections of law, tradition, and social class demonstrate that marriage in colonial America was as much about survival and property as it was about love. As the century wore on and America edged toward independence, changing attitudes began to influence marriage customs. Enlightenment ideas about individual rights, privacy, and romantic love started to challenge rigid traditions. The wedding bed ceremony slowly faded, replaced by more private celebrations and new legal standards. Yet, for much of the 18th century, this bizarre but powerful ritual remained a cornerstone of colonial marriage, a vivid example of how deeply personal life was shaped by public expectation and legal necessity. While court records and legal documents give us the framework of the wedding bed tradition, it is through personal letters, diaries, and memoirs that we catch glimpses of how individuals truly felt about this strange and intimate custom. These writings reveal the tension between societal expectations and private emotions, showing us the human side of a ritual that could be both deeply invasive and socially necessary. In the bustling port city of Philadelphia, the diary of Elizabeth Reed, a middle-class merchant's daughter, offers a rare and candid insight. Elizabeth was married in 1768, and though her wedding was modest compared to the grand affairs of colonial aristocrats, her experience of the wedding bed ceremony reflected the same pressures. In her journal, Elizabeth wrote about the night after her wedding. Though the room was filled with those I trusted, I felt as though my very soul was exposed. The eyes of family and friends weighed heavier than the linens on my skin. She confessed to feelings of vulnerability, yet also understood the importance of the ritual in securing her place in the community and ensuring her children's future. Elizabeth's words echo those of many women at the time, caught between fear, duty, and hope. The public nature of consummation was unsettling, but the consequences of avoiding it were often worse. A failed or contested marriage could bring scandal, legal battles, or even social exile. Across the colonies, letters between family members sometimes revealed anxiety about the ceremony. A letter from a Virginia mother to her daughter in 1752 cautioned her to honor the tradition of the wedding night, explaining that it was not merely custom, but the law of our people. The mother warned that any failure could cast doubt on your virtue and bring shame upon us all. Such letters show that the wedding bed was not just a matter of personal privacy. It was a matter of family honor and survival. For women especially, the ceremony was a public test of character, with lasting implications. In contrast, some men's writings show a mix of obligation and discomfort. A New England minister recorded his thoughts after attending several wedding bed ceremonies, noting how the practice binds the couple before God and man, but also expressing sympathy for the awkwardness and strain it placed on young couples. Despite these varied feelings, the custom was rarely openly challenged in public. Its importance as a legal and social safeguard kept it firmly in place. Yet, beneath the surface, some couples found creative ways to maintain modesty, drawing curtains, dimming lights, or limiting the number of witnesses. A fascinating example comes from a letter found in a Connecticut family archive. The newlywed husband wrote about the wedding night, describing how only my father and the minister remained after the guests left. The candlelight softened, and my wife's cheeks flushed with both fear and hope. He expressed gratitude for their discretion, noting it helped preserve the couple's dignity. These personal stories underscore the delicate balance the wedding bed ceremony demanded, between public proof and private intimacy, between social obligation and personal comfort. Interestingly, some writings hint at growing discomfort with the tradition as the 18th century progressed. In letters from urban centers like Boston and Philadelphia, there are hints that younger generations viewed the practice as outdated or intrusive. The rise of Enlightenment thinking and changing attitudes toward privacy planted seeds for reform. Nevertheless, for much of the colonial period, the wedding bed ceremony was an accepted and expected part of marriage, an event where the community witnessed the first step of a new family's journey. These accounts bring to life the emotional complexity behind what might seem, to us, a strange historical curiosity. They reveal how deeply woven the ceremony was into the fabric of colonial society, shaping relationships, defining honor, and securing futures. As the 18th century gave way to the dawn of a new nation, America's social landscape began to shift dramatically. The upheaval of the Revolutionary War, combined with the spread of Enlightenment ideals, brought fresh perspectives on individual rights, privacy, and the nature of marriage itself. These changes gradually eroded the once rigid customs surrounding the wedding bed ceremony, ushering in an era of evolving marital norms. The wedding bed ritual, with its deeply public and invasive nature, began to feel increasingly out of step with emerging values. The emphasis on personal privacy, emotional connection, and romantic love challenged the older notion that marriage was primarily a legal and economic contract enforced by community scrutiny. By the late 1700s, many couples sought to celebrate their unions more privately. Letters from the period reflect a growing preference for intimate ceremonies and the avoidance of public wedding night rituals. In cities like Boston, Philadelphia, and New York, newlyweds often retreated from large gatherings soon after the wedding ceremony, keen to begin their married lives away from the watchful eyes of family and neighbors. Clergy members, once the staunchest enforcers of wedding traditions, also began to adapt. Sermons and church teachings increasingly emphasized marriage as a partnership of mutual affection and respect, rather than a rigid social contract bound by external proof. This shift was particularly influenced by Enlightenment thinkers who argued for individual liberty and the sanctity of private life. Legal reforms paralleled these cultural changes. While the importance of marriage and legitimate heirs remained, courts became less focused on scrutinizing wedding night rituals and more concerned with formal documentation such as marriage licenses and church records. The legal system began to respect personal privacy more fully, reducing the need for intrusive customs like the public wedding bed ceremony. However, this transition was neither swift nor uniform. In rural areas and among more conservative communities, older traditions persisted well into the early 19th century. Families continued to emphasize the importance of public acknowledgement of marriage, often maintaining elements of the wedding bed ritual in adapted forms. For example, in some farming communities, neighbors might still be invited to witness the couple's first evening together, though the ceremony was often more discreet. The emphasis shifted from proving consummation to celebrating community support for the marriage. In urban centers, the trend toward privacy and romance was more pronounced. Marriage was increasingly viewed as a personal bond, and public displays of intimacy became a private matter. Romantic love, once secondary to legal and economic considerations, rose to prominence as a defining feature of the marital ideal. The cultural landscape was further transformed by literature, poetry, and plays that celebrated romantic love and individual choice. These works influenced popular attitudes, encouraging couples to prioritize emotional connection over social obligation. One notable example is the rise of courtship novels and sentimental literature, which portrayed love and marriage as deeply personal and private experiences. These stories contributed to the declining popularity of rituals like the wedding bed ceremony, framing them as relics of a harsher, less understanding era. Despite these shifts, the echoes of the wedding bed tradition remained embedded in American society. Legal concerns about legitimacy and inheritance continued, though handled with more discretion. Social expectations around marriage evolved, blending respect for privacy with ongoing community interest. By the mid-19th century, the once common wedding bed ceremony had largely disappeared from American life, replaced by private celebrations and a greater focus on personal happiness within marriage. Yet, the legacy of this tradition offers valuable insight into how early Americans balanced individual desires with societal demands. It reminds us that marriage, far from being purely a private affair, has always been shaped by the tensions between public obligation and personal freedom. The waning of the wedding bed tradition coincided with significant shifts in women's roles within marriage and society at large during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. As America transformed politically and culturally, women's experiences of marriage evolved from rigid social contracts governed by public ritual toward more personal and emotional partnerships, though legal and societal inequalities remained entrenched. For centuries, colonial marriage had placed heavy burdens on women, binding their virtue and honor to public proof of consummation and community approval. The wedding bed ceremony was a stark symbol of this control, where a woman's body was subject to scrutiny to secure property rights and family honor. With the ceremony's decline, some space opened for women to assert greater privacy and personal agency, but challenges persisted. Early American women lived under the doctrine of coverture, a legal principle where a married woman's identity and rights were absorbed by her husband's. Under coverture, women could not own property independently, enter contracts, or initiate legal action. Their social standing was inseparable from their husbands, and their primary roles were as wives, mothers, and caretakers. However, the changing social climate brought subtle shifts. The rise of the Republican motherhood ideal encouraged women to cultivate virtue, education, and moral guidance for their children, positioning them as important contributors to the new nation's future. This elevated the importance of women's roles within the family, though it did not grant them political rights or full legal independence. Personal writings from the period reflect women's complex feelings about marriage and societal expectations. Letters and diaries reveal a mixture of devotion, frustration, and hope. Some women embraced the growing emphasis on affection and partnership, while others felt constrained by lingering legal and social limitations. For example, a letter from Abigail Adams to her husband John in 1776 famously urged him to remember the ladies as the new nation defined its laws, highlighting early calls for women's consideration and rights. Though the immediate political impact was limited, such sentiments marked the beginning of a long conversation about women's place in marriage and society. The decline of public rituals like the wedding bed ceremony allowed women more control over their private lives, but it did not erase the power imbalances within marriage. Husbands still wielded significant authority, and women's legal and economic dependence remained a barrier to full equality. Social customs, however, increasingly recognized the importance of mutual affection and companionship. Marriage was no longer viewed solely as a contract for property and lineage, but also as a personal relationship shaped by emotional bonds. This shift affected women's expectations and experiences within marriage. Some women found new opportunities for influence within their households, managing finances, raising children, and participating in community affairs. Others faced pressures to conform to ideals of domesticity and femininity that emphasized self-sacrifice and moral leadership. At the same time, literature and popular culture of the era began to portray marriage in more nuanced ways, exploring the joys and struggles of partnership. Novels by authors like Susanna Rosen and Hannah Webster Foster depicted women navigating love, social constraints, and personal ambition within the framework of marriage. Yet, beneath these changes, legal restrictions persisted. Married women's property rights were often limited or controlled by their husbands, and divorce remained difficult and socially stigmatized. The legacy of traditions like the wedding bed ceremony, where women's bodies and virtue were public concerns, lingered in laws and cultural attitudes. In some cases, the emphasis on privacy and affection created new challenges. The retreat from public rituals meant less communal oversight, which could leave women vulnerable to neglect or abuse within marriage. Without community rituals like the wedding bed ceremony to publicly affirm commitments, marital disputes often became private matters, harder to address or intervene in. Despite these complexities, the period marked a gradual redefinition of marriage and women's roles within it. The fading of the wedding bed ritual symbolized broader social shifts toward individual rights and personal dignity, principles that would continue to develop over the coming centuries. In sum, women in early America experienced marriage as a site of both constraint and possibility. The erosion of public, invasive rituals opened doors for greater privacy and emotional connection, even as legal inequalities and social expectations maintained traditional power dynamics. As the 19th century unfolded, the American approach to marriage and family life underwent profound changes. The rigid rituals and public scrutiny that characterized colonial weddings, such as the infamous wedding bed ceremony, gradually gave way to more private, sentimental, and romantic customs. This shift reflected broader social transformations driven by industrialization, urbanization, and evolving cultural ideals. Courtship in 19th century America became a carefully choreographed dance of mutual affection and social approval, often marked by modesty, restraint, and community involvement. Unlike the earlier eras where marriage was predominantly a contractual arrangement centered on property and lineage, love and personal choice took center stage. The public wedding bed ritual, once critical to verifying a marriage's legitimacy, had largely disappeared, replaced by more private expressions of commitment. In rural communities, courtship was often a communal affair. Young men and women met during social gatherings, church events, or communal work projects. Families played active roles in overseeing courtship, ensuring suitors were suitable both morally and economically. Letters and diaries from the era reveal the importance placed on reputation, character, and family background. Take, for example, the correspondence between a young Pennsylvania couple, Samuel and Mary, who exchanged letters over several months before marriage. Their letters reveal tender expressions of affection, hopes for the future, and the anxieties typical of courtship at the time. Samuel often mentioned his desire to build a stable home and care for Mary, reflecting the ideal of marriage as a partnership rooted in mutual responsibility. In urban centers, courtship practices adapted to the bustling city environment. With increased anonymity and social mobility, young couples found more freedom to interact away from family oversight. Yet, social conventions still guided behavior, emphasizing modesty and propriety. Public dances, church socials, and literary societies offered venues for meeting potential spouses. The wedding itself became a more personal celebration, emphasizing sentiment and symbolism rather than public proof of consummation. Bridal attire, flowers, and vows took on greater emotional significance, reflecting the romantic ideals of the era. The ceremony was often followed by a reception where family and friends gathered to celebrate, but the couple's private life remained their own. Family life in the 19th century also reflected these evolving values. The ideal of the cult of domesticity emerged, portraying the home as a sanctuary where women exercised moral influence and nurtured family virtues. Husbands were expected to provide financial support, while wives managed household affairs and raised children with care and affection. While these ideals shaped middle and upper-class families, the realities of working-class and rural life were often more complex. Economic pressures, labor demands, and social challenges influenced family dynamics, sometimes limiting the reach of romantic ideals. Nonetheless, the emphasis on love, privacy, and mutual respect marked a significant departure from earlier centuries. Marriage was no longer primarily about property and lineage, but about companionship and personal fulfillment. This evolution also influenced legal frameworks. Marriage laws became more standardized, focusing on consent and formal registration rather than invasive rituals. Divorce, though still stigmatized, became slightly more accessible under certain conditions, reflecting changing attitudes toward marital breakdowns. The disappearance of the wedding bed ceremony symbolized this broader transformation. No longer was the community's gaze required to validate the intimacy of marriage. Instead, the couple's private bond took precedence. Yet, echoes of past traditions remained. Social expectations about fidelity, virtue, and family honor continued to shape behavior. Community approval was still valued, and public scandals could tarnish reputations. Personal letters and memoirs from the period reveal both the joys and challenges of these new marital norms. Couples celebrated affection and companionship, but also navigated social pressures and personal sacrifices. For instance, a letter from a young wife in New England describes her hopes for a happy marriage built on mutual respect, yet also her fears about balancing household duties and personal desires. Such writings provide rich insight into the lived experiences behind historical trends. As America moved toward the Civil War and beyond, marriage continued to evolve, influenced by changing social, economic, and political forces. The shift away from public rituals like the wedding bed ceremony marked a crucial step toward modern concepts of love, privacy, and partnership. To understand the sweeping changes in marriage customs during the 19th century, it helps to examine the personal stories of couples who lived through this era of transition. These case studies illuminate how evolving ideas about love, privacy, and partnership played out against the backdrop of America's growing pains. One compelling example comes from the correspondence and diaries of John and Abigail Thornton, a middle-class couple from Massachusetts who married in the 1820s. John was a school teacher, and Abigail the daughter of a local merchant. Their letters reveal a marriage grounded in mutual respect and affection, quite different from the more transactional unions of previous generations. In one letter, John writes tenderly to Abigail about his hopes for their future: to build a home where love guides us, not merely duty. Abigail's diary entries echo this sentiment, expressing joy in the small daily moments they shared and a desire for a partnership based on equality. Their marriage also reflected the era's gender expectations. Abigail took pride in managing their household and raising their children, but she also engaged intellectually with John, discussing books and current events. Their relationship exemplified the growing ideal of marriage as a partnership that nurtured both affection and personal growth. Contrast this with the experience of Samuel and Martha Carter, a rural farming couple from Virginia who married in the 1830s. Their marriage was shaped by different circumstances. Letters and farm records reveal the challenges of economic hardship, social expectations, and family responsibilities. Samuel's letters express deep affection for Martha but also concern about their ability to provide for a large family. Martha's writings reflect resilience and dedication but also moments of frustration with the demands placed upon her. Their marriage embodied the persistent tensions between romantic ideals and economic realities. While love and commitment were important, survival and practical concerns often dictated daily life. Another fascinating case is that of Emily and Thomas Wheeler, a couple from New York City who married in 1845. Emily was a school teacher and abolitionist, while Thomas was a young lawyer involved in reform movements. Their correspondence reveals a marriage engaged with the social and political currents of their time. They supported each other's ambitions and shared a commitment to progressive causes. Their partnership was both personal and political. Emily's letters describe the challenges of balancing public activism with domestic expectations, while Thomas's writings highlight the evolving role of men in supporting women's aspirations. Together, they illustrate how marriage could be a site of negotiation and change, reflecting broader shifts in American society. These case studies show the diversity of 19th-century marriages, shaped by class, geography, occupation, and personal values. Yet, they share common themes: the rise of emotional connection, the importance of mutual respect, and the ongoing negotiation between individual desires and social expectations. The legacy of earlier traditions, such as the wedding bed ceremony, lingered in subtle ways. Community approval, family honor, and legal recognition remained important. But the intrusive public rituals gave way to private expressions of love and commitment. These couples lived in a time when marriage was becoming less about public proof and more about private partnership. This transformation laid the groundwork for the modern institution of marriage familiar today. By the late 19th century, America had undergone immense social, economic, and cultural changes, and these transformations profoundly affected family life and marriage. The earlier shifts from rigid, public rituals to private, romantic partnerships set the stage for evolving gender roles, family dynamics, and societal expectations that defined this era. One of the most significant changes was the growing idealization of the nuclear family, centered on a husband, wife, and their children, living in a private household. The home became regarded as a moral refuge from the growing complexities of urban and industrial life, a place where women exercised their influence as caretakers and moral guides. The cult of domesticity, which had its roots in earlier centuries, reached its peak during this time. Women were idealized as the angels of the home, responsible for nurturing virtue, education, and piety in their children. Their work, though often unpaid and unacknowledged outside the household, was seen as essential to the nation's moral fabric. Marriage, increasingly based on love and mutual respect, reinforced these gendered roles. Husbands were expected to provide financially, while wives managed the home and family. The legal doctrine of coverture was gradually weakened by state laws granting married women limited property rights, but many inequalities persisted. This era also saw the rise of companionate marriage, the idea that spouses should be friends and partners sharing emotional intimacy and mutual support. This contrasted with earlier views that saw marriage primarily as a legal or economic arrangement. Personal letters and diaries from the period reflect these changes. Many women expressed pride in their roles as homemakers, but also a desire for intellectual engagement and personal fulfillment. Men wrote about their responsibilities as providers and protectors, as well as the importance of affection and understanding within marriage. However, these ideals often clashed with social realities. Industrialization and urbanization brought new challenges, including economic instability, crowded living conditions, and social dislocation. Families faced pressures from outside influences, including labor demands, immigration, and changing social mores. For working-class families, marriage and family life could be fraught with hardship. Women often worked outside the home in factories or as domestic servants, balancing wage labor with household duties. Marriages were tested by economic stress, health issues, and social upheaval. At the same time, social reform movements emerged to address these challenges. Women's suffrage, temperance, and labor rights campaigns highlighted the connections between family life, gender equality, and social justice. These movements shaped public conversations about marriage and family roles. Education also played a key role in changing attitudes. As public schooling expanded, children's upbringing became more structured, and women's roles as educators within the home gained importance. Literacy and literacy rates increased, enabling wider dissemination of ideas about marriage, family, and gender. Legal reforms continued to improve women's status, including laws allowing married women to own property, initiate divorce in certain cases, and gain custody of children. These changes reflected the gradual erosion of patriarchal control in marriage. Yet, tensions remained. Social expectations still emphasized women's submissiveness and men's authority. Divorce carried stigma, and unmarried women faced limited economic opportunities. The ideal of a harmonious companionate marriage was not always attainable. The late 19th century also saw the rise of new cultural forms, novels, plays, and newspapers, that explored the complexities of marriage and family life. These works often portrayed the challenges of balancing love, duty, and personal freedom. In sum, the late 1800s were a period of negotiation and change, as Americans redefined marriage and family amid rapid social transformation. The decline of intrusive public rituals like the wedding bed ceremony symbolized a broader shift toward privacy, emotional connection, and individual rights. Understanding this era helps us appreciate how marriage evolved into the modern institution we recognize today, a complex blend of tradition, romance, legal contract, and social expectation. As we close our journey through the curious and often uncomfortable customs surrounding marriage in 18th and 19th century America, it becomes clear that these traditions shaped far more than just individual weddings. They helped forge the social fabric of a young nation wrestling with ideas of privacy, morality, and partnership. The wedding bed ceremony, once a public spectacle designed to prove consummation and secure family honor, now seems almost unimaginable to modern sensibilities. Yet, it was born from very real concerns: protecting inheritance rights, ensuring social order, and maintaining communal trust in an era when legal documents and centralized authorities were less reliable than today. Its gradual disappearance marked a profound cultural shift, from a community-centered view of marriage as a public institution to an understanding of it as a private, emotional, and personal relationship. This transition reflected broader Enlightenment ideals emphasizing individual rights, consent, and personal dignity. The stories of women like Elizabeth Reed and couples such as the Thorntons and Wheelers show us the human face behind these shifts. Individuals negotiating tradition, law, and evolving personal desires. Their letters and diaries provide invaluable windows into the hopes, fears, and complexities of marriage as both a social contract and a deeply intimate union. Furthermore, the evolving roles of women, from being subject to strict public scrutiny to becoming moral guides and intellectual partners, highlight the intersection of marital customs with the larger struggles for women's rights and autonomy. Though legal inequalities persisted, the seeds of change were sown in these intimate domestic spaces. The 19th century's embrace of romantic love, companionate marriage, and privacy reshaped not only wedding nights but entire family dynamics. The ideal of marriage as a partnership based on mutual affection remains a cornerstone of American cultural values today. Yet, it is important to recognize that the legacy of these early customs still echoes. Issues of privacy, consent, and social expectations continue to shape conversations about marriage and relationships. The balance between public acknowledgement and private commitment remains a dynamic tension in society. Studying these historical customs also challenges modern assumptions. What may seem bizarre or invasive today was once a pragmatic solution to societal needs. Understanding the context helps us appreciate how marriage has always been more than a personal choice. It is deeply embedded in cultural, legal, and economic frameworks. As America moved beyond the 19th century, marriage continued to evolve, shaped by industrialization, urbanization, changing gender roles, and social reforms. The traditions we explored remind us that marriage is not static but continually redefined by the people who live it. In reflecting on this evolution, we gain perspective on current debates about marriage, gender, and family. History teaches us that customs once deemed essential can fade, and new practices can emerge, reflecting shifting values and social realities. Ultimately, the story of why nobles held public weddings in bed, and why that practice disappeared, reveals much about how Americans have navigated the complex intersections of love, law, and community. It invites us to consider how our own marital customs might be viewed by future generations.